Welcome to the Marketing Remix, presented by Red Door Interactive. I'm Reed Carr, CEO of Red Door Interactive. Our show is a senior-level marketer's resource for navigating our ever-evolving landscape. In each episode, in about 20 minutes, experts from different marketing disciplines representing different buyer touchpoints tackle one important marketing topic. Then, what do you need to know, and how does it affect the buyer? Welcome to the episode on GDPR and what it means for media. The arrival of General Data Protection Regulation, also known as GDPR, is expected to set a new standard for consumer rights regarding their data. While the regulation presents a variety of implications for brands, whether it be the systems and processes required to comply or the protection of user information and data, it will undoubtedly have a substantial impact on those running paid media. In this episode, we'll break down GDPR, its ramifications, and what the regulation means for targeting and DMPs. So we're joined this time by Heather Molina, our Senior Director of Paid and Earned Media, and John Ferris, Red Door's President. Before we have them chime in about what we're going to talk about here on GDPR, it is important to note that we're not attorneys. It's not intended to constitute legal advice, so the information contained herein does not constitute legal opinion and should not be regarded as a substitute for legal advice. Given the importance of the subject matter, if you have any legal questions about the information or topic presented here, we definitely recommend you seek the advice of an attorney. So with that in mind, I want to welcome Heather and John. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thanks for having us, Reed.
So we're going to jump right in. And the first question I want to ask, and I'm going to point this to John, is what is GDPR and why is it significant for marketers?
Yeah, thanks, Reed. I think you did a good job of setting it up. It's the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a regulation coming out of the European Union, and it was created with the purpose of protecting consumer personal data and privacy rights. So essentially, users have to give active consent if you're going to collect their personal data. They need to have access to their data and have the ability to easily revoke that consent. And it also requires companies to pay attention to their data collection, retention, and processing, and to really minimize that as much as possible and be collecting data that they're only collecting data that they're planning to use for a legitimate business purpose, and be very transparent about that with consumers and not hiding behind the terms of use or privacy policy that's crafted within legalese. It needs to be in plain language when you're gathering that consent and telling people how you're going to use that data. And then finally, companies have to take active measures to protect personal data and implement data breach protocol. And one of the requirements is that you notify the consumer as well as the governing body within 72 hours of any data breach that contains personal information of European residents. And that's really one of the nuances that's really important is this doesn't just apply to European companies. It applies to anybody that's dealing with European residents. And so if you're a website in the US and you're selling to people in Europe, or even you're a website, a company in the US that has a website with traffic from European residents, then this law applies to you. It goes into effect on May 25th. And really the significance for marketers is going to change the way that we collect data, change the way that we consume data, and we'll be talking about a little bit more, change the way that companies are going to be able to use data in the context of advertising. So that's a really quick overview. There's a lot more information about GDPR on our blog at reddoor.biz/learn if you want to check that out.
All right, one of the first things you had mentioned there, John, was the idea of active consent. Can you give the marketers here that are listening to us a little bit more definition of what that is?
Yeah, so in the past, companies in the EU and more privacy-oriented companies in the US have often kind of provided notifications that cookies are being used on the website to track user behavior. But that cookie banner with a message that says, by using the site, you accept cookies, is not going to be valid consent in the construct of GDPR. So consent has to be given with clear affirmative action, and it has to be specific. So beyond just cookies, you need to notify people that it's any sort of data that you're collecting about them. That could be through tags, pixels, forms, and that sort of thing. And somebody has to actively accept that consent, provide that consent. So you can't have any kind of pre-ticked boxes and that have been pretty common for things like collecting email. And you need to be very specific in terms of gaining consent for the distinct types of data that you're collecting and the reason why you're collecting that data. And then lastly, you need to log and document that consent. So when people are clicking OK on your consent banner, you need to log the fact that they've clicked that, and if they haven't accepted that, then you need to start providing them with options on what data tracking they would like to opt out of.
That makes sense. Now, obviously, so much of this feels like it's a big part of what's happening on the site, but the other part I want to talk about, and this one's going to go to Heather here, what are the implications for moving forward now running media, what we're doing to reach out and then bring people back to the site?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Reed. I mean, because there are a lot of implications around media and just how we go about conducting and getting things done. There's been so much success in the most recent years with a lot of the changes around retargeting and granularity that you could have on reaching your audience. There's been so much conversation around audience targeting, on Facebook and other platforms like that, and even in the programmatic space. And this change does impact our ability as marketers and media buyers to go out there and target those people. More so, obviously, in the EU, because there is going to be this aggressive approach to, or this aggressive outlay of getting people's consent to be able to target them, whereas in the States right now, we don't have that consent to target consumers that are in the US. But as Don mentioned earlier, because you're going to see these types of changes on brands' sites on collecting information and being able to educate consumers on how their data is being used, we do anticipate that those users in the US are going to some degree, some of them are probably going to opt out. So ultimately what this means is when we are talking about how we are doing retargeting and audience targeting at a granular level, things are going to shift and change in the way of things are probably going to get slightly more expensive over time to go after those more granular type of audiences and retargeting. You're also going to see a change up in terms of the technology that you're using to actually do a lot of this stuff. So technology partners, I think there's going to be probably a gradual overhaul in the States as to how those technology partners are utilizing data. And so the terms that we've come to play with in the last few years, things like data leakage, and you use one technology partner to do something for your site when it comes to media buying, and they have other partners who are attached to them. That type of data leakage and where your data or a consumer's data is being used, that's going to start to tighten up and get much cleaner. It's not been as much of an issue in the States, but we do anticipate that some of these GDPR things are going to start to bleed over into the States in terms of eventual legislation that could come into play where it does impact more aggressively how we are targeting consumers. In terms of how this is already playing out in the platforms and what marketers should be keeping in mind when they're doing media buying or when they have their teams doing media buying, is taking a look at all of the partners that you run with from a media perspective. So obviously Google and Facebook, because they're two of the biggest, and they are really getting in alignment and pushing out their messaging around how they are working with publishers and brands and the different products that they offer from a media buying perspective around GDPR and consumer privacy and how data is used. But there are a whole host of other publishers out there that I would encourage marketers to reach out to if they are using them and ask them, hey, how are you complying with GDPR? What is your internal plan or your business plan around GDPR and the type of targeting that we're able to tap into and the publishers that you tap into, say from a programmatic perspective, that really assure us that, when we're buying media from you, and using you as a technology or programmatic partner, making sure that everything that you're doing complies with GDPR law. So this is a time where marketers, especially in the US and absolutely in the EU, but in the US, should be doing due diligence and asking all of their advertising partners simply, what are you doing to comply with GDPR law? And seeing what their response is and seeing, how thorough or intelligent and responsive they are when they come back to you with their answers.
That makes sense. I mean, I think right now, if we were to ask that question, the marketers were to ask that question today versus what they may in 6 months from now and a year from now, it's probably more about understanding how they're going to approach it, and the answers may be somewhat inconsistent.
Yeah.
But I would imagine that what's important is that they are thinking about it, and you're hearing, as we get deeper into this and see how the laws evolve, or certainly how people are being held to those laws. If they start seeing some consistency over time, I think, would you agree with that? Do you think that there's some expectation we should have at this point that'll be compared to, something a year from now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because there is so much gray area, around it. And I think that, as John was alluding to earlier, what they consider PII or personal identification information, what we operate off of, 2 months ago, thinking it's, people's names, their social security numbers, their addresses, things that are very attached to them, that's shifting, and including, as you mentioned earlier, the triangulation of all these other data points like sexual preference, race, IP address, MAC address, all of that stuff. The more granular you get with that targeting, it's from what we are understanding, because again, GDPR is written very, I don't want to say vaguely, but it's written in a way that it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and that's what's worrying and concerning to people, especially companies, is how this is all going to be interpreted once May 25th actually hits. All of those things are written so gray that it's more, I like to think of it as we're all doing our due diligence for May 25th, and then May 25th is really the start of all of this. So how this is all going to play out and how things shift in terms of really coming to a point where we're honing in on exactly how everyone should be complying with GDPR law and what exactly we have to do versus what we don't have to do, that's all going to start to unfold, I believe, after May 25th, once we see how this all goes out and goes into play. But right now, the basics is really what we are talking about in terms of understanding, okay, exactly how your data is being used, doing your data audit as to what is coming into your site, and how your tags on your site from a media perspective, anything that you have tagged, how that data is being collected, where it's being stored, who controls that data. Do you as the brand control it, or does the publisher or the technology control it? Understanding the role as a data processor, all that stuff, a simple, data audit on the site is something that we would encourage brands to do as well.
Which, by the way, is a very fruitful exercise, regardless of GDPR or not. Understanding all of the data that you're collecting is going to be beneficial to the brand, even when it comes to things like targeting and personalization. If you don't have a great inventory of the data that you're collecting today, then you're probably not taking advantage of it as well as you could.
Right. And there's a bunch of key roles and the definitions of those roles that people need to start getting familiar with. John, maybe you can highlight a few of those because Heather kind of alluded to some, but, what are some terms that people are going to need to start getting familiar with right now?
Yeah, so the main ones are going to be controller, processor, and subprocessor. And the controller of data essentially is the one that determines what data they want to collect and how they're going to use it. And then the processors oftentimes are the ones that are the platforms in the marketing technology ecosystem that are actually using that data and taking action based off of that data, whether it's to target ads or personalize a website experience, et cetera. And then a subprocessor is just a processor that's working with another processor to actually leverage data for another purpose.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's important that marketers are starting to understand these terms, start using them liberally, understand the point of all of this stuff, which I think you guys both explained real well. Knowing that this is an evolution, go back to Heather on this question, which is around the idea of what is the most effective way to approach audience targeting now that things have changed. I mean, 2 months ago compared to where we're going, what's foundational to how we should start thinking of it going forward?
So just looking at the media or the marketing mix in terms of what people tend to actually use especially in their digital marketing efforts, you're looking at Google and Facebook. So just starting with those two, with Google and Facebook, if you're using just the general retargeting stuff that they have built in, you're probably not going to have to worry. Like Facebook has come to the table in recent week and has stated, exactly how each of their different marketing products and targeting products are going to be impacted. So if you're using just the basic targeting and retargeting stuff on Facebook, you're going to be fine, because that one is set up pretty straightforward with all the processes and regulations in mind. Anything that you're doing with a Facebook pixel or custom audiences on Facebook, that's where it gets a little more complicated, because you're going to need to get consent from users you are targeting, especially through that Facebook pixel, to collect the data on products that they're viewing that you're offering out there. Any different demographic data that's associated with them, and any ad conversion measurement data you're collecting on because of the Facebook stuff, that's where it gets more complicated, and you're going to have to do more due diligence in messaging to those consumers how you're using the data. With custom audiences, that's something that we've been doing a lot at Red Door with some of our clients, or we've started to, and we've had great success, and there's a reason, because you can get really granular and really specific, and it gets even trickier. So, with the Facebook pixel, when you place that on your site, you become, that puts Facebook as the data controller. But with custom audiences, you are uploading data into Facebook, whether it's an email list or any other kind of marketing data that you have on your audience. So that's where you become the data controller, and Facebook is not the data controller. You guys kind of share that effort right there. They are the data. You are the data controller in that sense. Facebook plays a role that's somewhat data controller, but more data processor. So that's where it gets even more complex in terms of understanding how you're using all of this targeting. And so Facebook is putting in place different layers of consent, I would call consent permission, to show that, different consent permission things that you have to basically upload into Facebook in addition to any data. You have to show that you have permission to use all this data that you've just uploaded. So these are things that they are starting to put into place and rolling out just this, most recent week, that they've started to put this stuff, at least messaging around it out. And then in the next couple of weeks, this is all going to be ramped up and rolling. So in terms of their platform and being able to upload this stuff into there, as we start to see that information and see how all of that is connected and what the requirements are, those are things that, Red Door will be pushing information out to our current clients and prospective clients and audiences to understand exactly what those privacy policies look like, how you're going to be able to interact with some of these different marketing tools that are on Facebook. And ultimately, Facebook's goal is to be able to help marketers collect consent in real time by developing all these new features and stuff. So I would have to say that out of all of the publishers and platforms that we're working with, Facebook has really been one that has come to the table and said, we know our marketing partners, or our advertising partners rather, really have had a lot of great success with audience targeting on our platform. Therefore, we're starting to build in all of this stuff and make it easy for them to continue to do what has worked really great and well for them in driving and hitting client or brand goals. Google, that's one that's sort of slowly evolving right now, and there'll be more to come on that. But they have certainly taken an approach to, at least, from the brand side, it's less concerning. It's more if you're a publisher that works within their network and, shows their ads on it, that's where it gets a little more tricky. So, that's one that we can talk about at a later date, because that one really doesn't impact marketers so much directly. It's more the publishers that it directly impacts. But basically, with the two biggest platforms that we tend to see, and marketers in general tend to see a lot of dollars going into these days, there's less concern and less worry because they are doing their due diligence and they are messaging around it. It's really those other publishing platforms where, they have, it's a lot more tricky, and they are probably not messaging as aggressively around exactly what the implications are and how their network is going to work. But when it comes to overall marketing efforts, I would say Facebook and Google are really pushing forward with being able to help guide brands through the process and being able to still tap into these deeper level targeting efforts.
And I think that's where some of the advantage in this case does go to the bigger players out there, because there's a lot to deal with and they have the infrastructure and the perspective to deal with it. So, I think that's kind of one of the, I guess, maybe unintended consequences of GDPR, and we'll see how that plays out long term. But the last point or last thing I'd like to cover here, and I want to put this over to you, John, to give us some final words on, is one of the other terms that I want to make sure people get from this, which is the DMP or the data management platform. And that's your centralized data management platform. It allows you to create target audiences based on first party, third party, that sort of thing. How should the brands navigate the DMPs now, and how's that going to change as it relates to GDPR? And let's bring us home here on this topic.
Sure. Yeah. So DMPs are in a bit of a dicey position, particularly in Europe, because they control and process a lot of third-party data. And the chain of custody for third-party data is often pretty murky. So first-party data is data that you collect on your own site, your own customers. Second-party data would be data that's provided to you by a partner. And within the marketing ecosystem, that partner could be somebody that's conducting first-party survey work like a Resonate, or it could be a big media or e-commerce giant like Amazon. So we can leverage Amazon data to target ads. The third-party data is data that's aggregated from a bunch of different sources. And the chain of custody, like I said, on consent is much more of a gray area there. So you don't always know that data that you're buying from a third party was gathered through with permission from the consumer, right? So you've got to be really picky with the third party data providers that you work with. And some of that will shake out over time within the DMP landscape, and they'll do all of their due diligence to ensure that the third-party data providers that they're working with have gathered consent to obtain that data. So to a degree, long-term, it might actually play in the favor of marketers because we'll end up with better quality third-party data. And so mainly the best thing that you can do is ask all of your ad tech partners, like Heather was saying, and in fact, like all of your marketing technology partners, how they're baking in privacy by design into their platforms. And you should really only be collecting the data, of course, that you've gotten consent to collect, and also that you are going to use for a legitimate business purpose. And that will go a long way in ensuring that you're complying, whether you're using a DMP or a DSP or doing a third-party data buy directly from a broker. And then the other thing to think about beyond DMP is also your tag management solution. And if you have a customer data platform in place, those are actually going to be really important in the future in terms of being able to provide that access to consumers of their own data profile and making that data profile portable and also forgettable, deletable. So tag management does a great job of giving marketers the ability to be able to turn tags on and off based off of how a consumer has requested to have their tracking be treated by you. And then a CDP, a customer data platform, would allow you to consolidate all of that data about one consumer into a 360-degree view of that consumer. And that then gives you the ability to forget or transfer that data to whoever the consumer would like you to.
All right. Well, there's a lot of ground to cover on GDPR. I want to thank John and Heather for joining us. If you want to learn more, John had mentioned it earlier, reddoor.biz/learn for our show notes and other downloadables and other things you can learn. Be sure to like and subscribe to our podcast here. We've got a lot of other topics coming up, and we'll see you next time.